Today is Friday, April 15th, and this is Chapter 2 in the Feehan family history. I'm going to be talking about my father and his family, and to some extent, my mother and her family. My father's father, John Feehan, was born in Corcoran, Minnesota, in 1870, I believe. He was the son of John Feehan, the immigrant who came from Rahan in County Offaly. And he had a number of brothers and sisters, and we have the list of his family members recorded. But my father had three sisters. Dessa, who was born in 1901, and Frances, who I believe was born about 1903. I don't have her exact birthday. And Eleanor, who was born in 1912. My dad was born in 1914. The three sisters were quite a group. They were really characters, each in their own way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. Dessa, the oldest one, was born in Minneapolis, but the family moved to Montana, to Missoula, Montana, probably when she was maybe about 12 or 13 years old, I believe. They moved to Montana, we think, because my grandmother had married a Conley, and John Conley, and Montana was thought by people in Minnesota to be kind of the new frontier. So Missoula was a very prosperous and growing town at the time, and my grandfather decided to move the family there because the economic prospects for him were better. But what he found out, apparently, at least from what we're told, is that the labor situation there was not very good, that the Irish immigrants were organizing. This was the time of the International Workers of the World, or Wobblies as they were called, and they were trying to organize in the sawmills and the various businesses in and around Missoula. And because my grandfather got involved in union organizing, he was more or less driven out of town. The merchants refused to sell him goods, and he was having a difficult time, so he moved the family back to Minneapolis. My dad, however, loved Missoula, and he actually, as a teenager, what they call rode the rails. He hopped a freight train back to Missoula from Minneapolis and spent some time there. But I think Dessa, the oldest of my dad's sisters, probably enjoyed Montana well enough that she may have stayed there. And she ended up working for a congressman or senator from Montana, and that's how we believe she got to Washington, D.C., where she met her husband, Howard. But before she met Howard, she married a gentleman by the name of King. We don't know much about him except his last name, but their marriage did not work out, and she ended up getting divorced and marrying Howard Marshall. Her younger sister, Frances, met a fellow from Missoula who was originally from Virginia by the name of Tom Duncan. And Tom eventually became a successful businessman with interests in insurance and real estate in Missoula, and the two of them spent their lives in Missoula. They had two sons, Tommy the oldest one, and John, or Pad as he was called, the younger of the two. Um, so Francis I only met once. That was on a long trip that I made with a friend of mine, and we stopped in Montana on the way back from traveling all over the West Coast and heading back to Minneapolis. But we met Pad at the time, and that was the first time I'd met him as well as Francis and Tom Duncan. So that covers Dessa and Francis. My dad's youngest sister, Eleanor was known in the neighborhood where they grew up in Minneapolis as a tomboy. And my dad used to tell stories about how when he was very young and he was being picked on by bullies in the neighborhood, he would call for his sister, and she might be 3 or 4 houses away, but she would come running, leaping over picket fences and hedges, and come to his rescue and beat up the boys that were troubling my dad. So she was quite a character, Eleanor was. Eleanor got back to Montana somehow, and she got involved with the U.S. Forest Service, and that's where she worked, and she was quite popular there. But she came back to Minneapolis when my grandmother got sick, and she took care of my grandmother for a while, and they moved to a house that my grandfather bought for them on 29th and Queen, 2901 Queen, actually. So Eleanor had a husband by the name of Glenn Harris, and the two of them had a daughter, my cousin Nora, who now lives in Arizona. Their marriage did not last, and Eleanor had difficulties, I think, with alcohol, something that sort of ran in the family. I think all 3 of the sisters had issues with alcohol, and I know when I visited Howard and Dessa in Washington for the first time, they were quite fond of having drinks, and I was invited over to dinner once when I got there. Both Howard and Dessa were quite inebriated, and Dessa was unable to make dinner, so Howard said he would make dinner, and what he made for dinner was a couple of fried eggs. But they were quite a couple. My Uncle Howard was chief of budget and finance for the forestry department. They had a very nice apartment that they had furnished with antiques that Dessa had found. And the apartment was on Columbia Pike. I think it was 4228 Columbia Pike in Arlington. They didn't own the apartment, but they owned a tree farm in one of the adjoining counties, and Howard was very fond of the tree farm. He owned it with a partner, and they had a cabin on the tree farm, and they used to go there on the weekends frequently. We have a picture or two, I think, of Dessa outside the tree farm. But Howard was he was interested in forestry, not just because he was a financial manager, but he really knew trees. He could identify all of the different species of trees that were on the tree farm. Howard was born in Akron, Ohio, and when he was a young boy, his father took the family on a cross-country train trip to California, to Bakersfield, which is where Howard grew up. And it was when Howard started getting interested in accounting that he got a job with the Forest Service, and his work with the Forest Service took him to Georgia and a number of other states. And it was when he was traveling, I believe, either in Georgia or to Washington, that he and Dessa met and eventually got married. But Howard was certainly one of my favorite uncles. Howard lived a long time. He was born in 1899, and he passed away in 1998, almost 100 years old. Dessa was the family member that had become the family historian and had the interest in Ireland. And it was her visit to Ireland in the 1930s, I believe. I think they took the Queen Mary, or it might have been the Queen Mary or another one of the big ships, ocean-going vessels at the time, to Ireland, and visited my great-grandfather Conley's former home in Drogheda, and they investigated his will. We have a copy of his will. His house was across the street from the big cathedral on Peter Street in Drogheda, and his house was later turned into the Central Hotel. And later, in 1985, when I visited Ireland with Professor Jim Cunningham and my friend Dennis Candy, we went to Drogheda, and I was hoping to see their house, but the house that he had been born in and lived in had been torn down, and the Central Hotel had moved to a different location, so I never got to see that. I did, however, stand on the sidewalk where the house had been and was able to see the cathedral across the street with the head of a famous bishop mummified inside that cathedral. He had been beheaded by Oliver Cromwell, the English conqueror of Ireland. Dessa was able to actually meet somebody who had known the Conley family and who had a shop on Peter Street. I'm going to pause here.